Good morning. This is the Government Accountability Committee meeting of October 3rd, 2022. I'd like to go around the table and have introductions. We also are going to be joined by the State Auditor, Doug Hoffer, who will be appearing on Zoom in about 15 minutes. And I think we have 6 of the 8 committee members with us. So I will start and tell you that I am Senator Brian Collmore, one of the co-chairs of the committee.
And I am State Representative Maida Townsend, the other co-chair of the committee, retiring from South Burlington.
Karen Dolan, one of the representatives from Essex Junction.
I'm Samantha LaFave, one of the representatives from Orange County District 1.
Justin Kenny, Chief Performance Officer for the state and the Vermont Agency of Administration.
Jessica Brumstead from Shelburne and St. George, and a House member.
I'm Jeanette White, retiring senator from Windham County.
And missing, but hopefully at some point, I think Senator Perchlik was going to join us. I think he was doing something else for a couple hours this morning, but could be able to join us later. And as I understand, Senator Kesharam Hinsdale is already in another committee meeting and will not be able to join us today. We're also joined by Amarin Aberjali and Tim Devlin from Legislative Council, and they will be up to talk to us about some of the things going on there. And Mike Ferrant, who is our committee assistant and ably pushing buttons today and helping out behind the scenes. So we probably want to introduce Tim because I don't know that everybody else. Senator White and I have had the opportunity to meet him with the Sunrise Advisory Commission. So we've already met, but Amarin, if you want to do the introductions, that'd be great.
Sure. For the record, Amarin Aberjali, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is Tim Devlin, our new legislative counsel, who's going to be taking over the government operations portfolio as I switch over to healthcare. So he will be here today doing much of the presenting work, and I am here for conference. You know my face. So we will be up with you in just a few minutes. Tim, you
want to tell us where you're from and all that kind of good stuff, the background? I know you're from Poultney.
I born and raised in Vermont here. I just finished up 3 years working for the city of Burlington and their legal department. And I'm very excited to be making the transition to the Capitol here and very much look forward to running all of you legal services. So that matter. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Amarin, I know I can only speak for this committee as the chair, but we see you often in government operations as well. Thank you for your efforts all through this kind of weird period we've had. It seems like we're getting back onto a little more level plane, but we're going to miss you. And the health and welfare committees have gained a very, very, very valuable person. So thank you very much for all you've done.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, 10:15, we were scheduled to hear from State Auditor Doug Hoffer. I understand he is with us already on Zoom.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. We will be looking at some of the other GAC-related provisions a little bit later today. Whoop, are you all set there?
I am, yes. Can you hear me?
But on Friday is when I received word from the deputy auditor, Tim Ash, requesting that we give you 15 minutes to bring us up to date on some of your findings and discussion. So as it turns out, you might have 20 minutes because we're a little bit early, but welcome and glad to have you with us today.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you squeezing me into your obviously tight agenda with so short notice. I appreciate that. I won't take too much of your time. Let me first say thank you to those of you who will be leaving the legislature for your good work over the years. I guess Jeanette and Maida, and if I missed anybody, I'm sorry. What we did is in this work, and by the way, you should probably bring up the report. I think it's easier if you do it on your own screen rather than my taking up the whole screen, which is sometimes not easy to read when you share. There's only a few pages and graphs that I'll refer to, but we started out with the assumption that we should try to identify best practices. And for that, we ended up with some information from the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB, the National State Auditors Association, and the Washington State Performance Measurement Guide. And we came up with some criteria that we thought were useful for our review and hopefully for you. And the first, given the use of population level measures, and this is in response to the RBA approach, the question really is, does the entity, in this case the state, have the ability to influence performance in a meaningful way? And that's going to vary across the board, obviously, but there are some where it's pretty clear we don't. Having said that, your report or Justin's report refers in some cases to indicators that are common, used all the time, and are important for an analysis of, for example, the state of the economy or the environment. The question is, how useful is it in evaluating state policy? And a perfect example is on page 8, figure 2, specifically the question of unemployment. And I've been dealing with these issues for 30 years, long before I had this job. And, every governor likes to say, look how low unemployment is. Isn't that great? And of course, the answer is generally yes. But the question is, what did you, governor, do to get us there? And if you look at that graph on page 8, you'll see that Vermont, like virtually every other state in the country, follows the national curve, up and down with recessions and other events of magnitude, because state policy, with few exceptions, maybe California, Texas, New York, the things that we do are important at the margins for some things, but they really have no impact whatsoever on an indicator like unemployment. So while it's important to report unemployment, I'm not sure it's ever been or will ever be a good measure of state policy in that regard. It's just something to think about. The second is, do the measures chosen have clear goals and objectives? And there's one that jumped out. There are others. From the population level, the question was, are Vermonters healthy and safe? And in particular, this was fall-related death rates. And obviously an important question, something to be tracked, and something that maybe the state can influence the outcomes of through monitoring and oversight of nursing homes and so forth. But in this case, the bar was set at a number that didn't seem to have any real basis. We dug in a little deeper and found that it came out of a report from the Department of Health. And the figure that you see is just a 10% decline from 2009. Now, obviously a decline is good, but why 10% and not 15 or 5 or 30? Something to think about. The next major section is significant and relevant, and that is, does the measure capture the most significant and relevant information that will help us understand whether the objective was achieved? So there's a couple that jumped out here. One is in response to the question, is Vermont a safe place to live? We looked at the rate of petitions for relief from domestic abuse, obviously a very important issue for Vermonters. But narrowing it to petitions and those granted, I think is not optimal for an obvious reason. We're not even sure what the correlation is, if any, between petitions sought and the actual reporting of abuse out in the world. And that figure is huge. It's 15, 20,000 instances a year, whereas the number of petitions is a tiny percentage of that. That doesn't mean the petition issue isn't important, again, but does it tell you the magnitude of the problem? And the answer is no, not really. So that was one. The other is, and I'll use this example a couple of times as we go forward, the question of prosperous economy. And first of all, prosperous economy isn't defined. Now, that's a big question, and I'm not sure it's your job, but it's important to keep in the background. And in this case, we look at median household income, and there were a couple of technical problems with this. One is the data comes from the ACS, the Census Bureau, which is great, but it's the 1-year data as opposed to the 5-year data. And you can appreciate why the latter is more useful, because 5 years gives it a chance to work through anomalies. You might have a single-year anomaly that doesn't really represent the trend. The other is that there was no adjustment for inflation. So the figures reported looks great. It looks like a 14% increase over 4 or 5 years, or I think it was 5, 6 years. And that sounds great. And again, the kind of thing a governor likes to say, but if it's adjusted for inflation, it's half that. And if it's half that, then that's a more realistic and a much more important, I would argue, factor for whether Vermonters' purchasing power has actually grown. And the answer is, 7% is not nearly as good as 14. The next one is comparability. And, is there contextual information and comparative data that helps the reader understand whether this is a meaningful conclusion, or you can draw meaningful conclusions from it? And here again, we look at median household income. And if you go to page 14 and look at figure 8, you see something we did, and that is even if you accept, well, not even, but if you assume that we use inflation adjusted figures, you see that Vermont is at 7%, but you also see that every state in northern New England grew. And that's a good thing. Everybody's made progress during that period. But in fact, Vermont grew the slowest of all those states. So we started with 14%, which might make people believe without a longer, deeper discussion, hey, whatever we're doing is great. Well, not sure about that. This shows that maybe what we're doing hasn't made that big a difference at all. It's kind of like unemployment. Everybody grew at a different rate. We could have a conversation about that. Are they pursuing policies that are significantly different than ours? Are they doing something better than us or not? I think that's an important issue. The comparability is always, it seems to me, very useful, not just for previous years, but other jurisdictions. Gives you really important context. The next one will take us to page 17 and figure 13, and we're still with median household income. This is about disaggregation and the importance of digging down a little bit. Even if we accept the inflation adjusted figure of 7%, which is positive and good as far as it goes, the question is, how is that impact distributed throughout the working population, or at least the households and families of Vermont? And when you look at that figure, you see, now this shouldn't surprise anyone. I mean, we've had this kind of skewed distribution of wealth and income for a long, long time, starting late 70s, early 80s, and it's not getting better. But here, if you only use the one figure, which started to be 14%, that would not likely drive a discussion about, hey, we can do better, we're not doing that well. This graph would probably generate or catalyze a different type of conversation, different types of policies. Is the information provided understandable? This is always tricky because not everybody's data savvy and there's a lot of ways to use it and present it. So if you go to the next page, page 18, and look at figure 14, and this is important. Obviously, it's an important measure, but two things are happening. One is the left y-axis, and this is a common thing when people create graphs because the default setting is often not to go to 0. And I don't know why Microsoft and Excel programming set it up that way, but it's common. I'm sure you've seen it many, many times. But if you don't go to 0, you can get a skewed and misleading view of the changes. Here, it looks like that's a pretty big drop, when in fact, the actual change is only from 6 incidents per 100,000 to 5. Furthermore, it's a rate and not a number. How many people actually are represented here? Not just a rate, but how many Vermonters, and that doesn't come out of the graph. On the next page, you see another one that's not dissimilar about ridership in public transit. And here too, we show a rate as opposed to the number. If you come away from this graph, you'll think, well, there hasn't been much change. Well, as a percentage, there hasn't been much change, but this graph doesn't tell us really anything about how many people rode public transit 5 years ago and last year. You don't know that from the graph. And I think that's important information for almost any reader, let alone a policymaker. And the last major issue is, are the measures specific and defined? And if you look at page 20, with regard to telecommunications, you see a graph based on data from the state that shows, pretty good coverage statewide for what's referred to as state-of-the-art telecommunications. But that term is not defined. And I think anybody in your room would scratch their head if asked, do you believe that 93% of Vermont has good state-of-the-art telecommunications? Well, if it did, why are we spending $500 million, to cover what's not covered? Compare that to a very good measure, which is from the health department world about binge drinking under people 18 to 24. It gives you everything you need. It gives you about the details about the group being measured, the time frame, and the activity itself. All of that is defined and presented. So that's a good one. And there are a lot of other good ones, but we're just pointing out the ones that don't meet the standards that we found for best practices in this report. So we could talk more about it. You know, each one of these major categories, we had several examples. I just gave you one just to, get it out there. So I know you guys weren't meeting during the session. This report was released in January, so this seems like a long lag. And I know I just saw on your website that Justin has the newest report up, so we're already a little out of date. But I wanted to give you this back then. Everybody was pretty busy. You all had other committee assignments, so I hope it's helpful going forward.
Senator White?
Thanks, Doug. I just have a question. So in looking at these 6 areas, how much of it is the way the indicators and outcomes are worded, and how much of it is, which is our responsibility, and how much of it is the interpretation of that and the reporting of that, which is the responsibility of the administration? I'm just trying to figure out here what this committee's responsibility would be around changing anything.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. In the first instance, I think it has to be the legislature's job to define those population level measures. And the first one, of course, is a prosperous economy. And going back to the example of the median household income, if you don't say anything about equity, then it won't get measured. Mm-hmm. You know, unless the administration itself, for its own reasons, chose to do that. But you can give them direction by adding some, not excruciating detail, because that's hard and time consuming. But if you give them some guidance for each of those, I think they're likely to do a better job. As for its presentation, there are some examples of ways that we suggest it can be done to help the reader, to make it more accessible, and also to provide, in some cases, better information. So a little of both.
Okay, thanks.
Representative Brumsted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hopper. I couldn't agree more with you. That I think that the concern I have here is that has some of what you discuss has not been our role in meeting a few times over summer, over the recess. It is more the role, we believe, I believe, and I don't want to speak for the committee, but I always thought that we would bring this information both to the administration and to our legislative committees. And our committees would dig deeper into why. Is it because we're collecting the wrong data? Or is it because the way we wrote the legislation might not have made the intent clear? Or is it also, I just reported a huge childcare bill. And I'm on this committee. So I asked a lot of questions about measurement. And we have Building Bright Futures. And they are one sort of entity that is collecting data that makes sense. But before that, the Agency of Human Services hands were tied financially to be able to collect and measure and put that data into a system that would allow it to be useful in exactly the way that you are promoting. And I think everyone here, everyone in the legislature couldn't agree more, but it is incredibly expensive. And do we as a citizen legislature have the skills to know exactly how to go after this information? It's so easy to misinterpret data, as you have pointed out, and something I think that is very concerning to all of us. So I appreciate your bringing it forward, but I also want you to understand sort of the position we're in this room a couple of times a year. Anyhow, so I don't know if I'm making a statement or just sort of saying, hey, there is some defense here.
There's no question about it. I understand and agree. And whenever people ask me about the work of my office, one of the things I tell them is the challenge for the legislature, for your part, in responding to the few of our recommendations that go to you. Most go to the administration, of course. And I argue to anyone who will listen that you guys need and deserve a lot more support, a lot more resources. I think the size of JFO should be doubled. I can't speak to Leg Council. They seem to have a lot of bodies. They seem to do what you need. But in terms of analysis of this type, you really do need a lot more help. Having said that, there are instances occasionally where I see a program either revised, amended, or brand new that includes some request of the administration, the department of the agency, for an analysis and an evaluation at some point. Yes, that has to be built into the cost of the program, but there's an even larger potential cost of not doing that, which is spending 5 years doing something that might not make any difference at all. If you don't know whether it's working, but you keep funding it, we're not getting ahead and we're not making the most of our limited resources. So I would say, if the administration has a proposal for a program, for example, the Agency of Commerce, an entity that I look at quite a bit, they came in the last few years. Some of it was, pandemic related, so the timeframes are a little scrunched, but they proposed spending hundreds of millions of dollars and said, go ahead and approve it and we'll come back with performance measurements later. Now, notwithstanding the need to act promptly as people were hurting, that's a recipe for failure for a lot of reasons. And
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree. Your homeless work, absolutely. How much of an impact do we have in our communities? We spent a lot of money. We all have transitional motel programs and have we really had an impact? I totally agree with you on what you're saying. I just want you to understand how we sit in that. We ask for that childcare bill. I pushed very hard to collect the data because I want to know at the end of 5 years, have we had an impact? Do we have more slots? Do we have more families that can afford the childcare? Do we have more people back in the workforce? How is that impacting the economy? I think all of us think about that. I just want you to understand that.
I do. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I am sympathetic.
Yes, Representative Dolan.
Yes, thank you, Auditor, for this report. I really appreciate it. And I think having you walk through some of those examples is very helpful. And I think it, as others have said, it really sheds light on kind of all the factors that we're navigating while we're trying to create this data of the different stakeholders that are creating the parameters, and then those who are reporting on the parameters. And then I think there's also this piece of trying to hold the big vision of the work that we're trying to accomplish, but then the urgency that comes of we need to show action and we need to show momentum on it. So it just is helpful. It seems like, oh yeah, we're juggling all of this. And I guess one of the pieces that I'm curious about from you is, it's easy for all of us to point out where the holes are and things like that's what we can do. Point out the holes, there are all of them. So I'm curious, two things and I think you just alluded to some of them. What are your recommendations for us, right? You said, the legislature needs some more support and analysis, that we should be asking if the administration has a proposal, being very clear on what are some of the indicators they're looking to have an impact on. So that's my first question. The other question is, I'm curious if you have something on that best practices piece, because I think that's something also for us to look to. What are other states doing? Because again, this isn't a new issue. This is how government works a lot of times.
Well, what other states are doing would take a lot of time to look into, at least 10 or 15, if not all 50. But Washington, as I said, has done a pretty good job with this, which is why we look to them as well as NSAA and GASB. But the question of how to get from here to there, I think starts with the administration, any administration, not just this one. If they propose a program or ask for money for an existing program, they're obligated to answer your questions and address your concern about performance. You have to say, look, this may be the best thing since sliced bread, but you have to be able to justify it down the road and not 5 or 10 years from now. And in truth, there are a number of programs that are created, not many, but some that are created based on anecdotal information or unexamined assumptions that are just accepted as received wisdom as opposed to an analysis. One thing in my travels through economic development and related tax policy is that look at the difference between the staff support for Ways and Means and Finance, which needs it and deserves it. Some would say, well, that's quantifiable. Well, much of economic development is quantifiable as well, but Commerce and Senate Economic Development don't have a designated JFO staff person. And there have been a few occasions during my tenure and before when an issue was considered important enough or an omnibus bill had enough elements to it or it was controversial that they went to either existing JFO staff or Tom Cavett and said, we really need a fiscal note. And then you get a very focused analysis. And I think in many cases, his work, their work in that regard has been used to good advantage because you guys are dependent and reliant on information from the administration, which may or may not be as rigorous as what you get from JFO and Tom. A good example is TIF. Sadly, we're losing Graham Campbell, as I think you know, who's moving to New Zealand. He's a very good analyst. He did two, yeah. Whoever didn't know that, give him a call. Yeah.
I didn't know it.
Yeah, it's too bad. He did two very good reports at your request, the legislature's request, every other year on TIF, which is something we are buried in because of you. Thank you very much for that unfunded mandate. And he did a wonderful job. It's tough sledding at times, and you guys are all busy with your own committees and lives, but that's a tool. And it would be great if in the course of dealing with large programs that you did more of that. They're going to need more money to do that. You know, Catherine, like her predecessor, Steve, will tell you, I can't do everything. And you guys ask them always to do a lot, as you should. You know, I don't know whether Vermonters understand how the system works and how it can be improved. And a lot of people would say, I don't want to give those guys any more money. Well, if you want to do a better job, you need more resources. And I'm happy to stand with you and say that, frankly.
Thank you.
Not that anybody would care what I said, but you know what I mean.
They don't care what we say either.
Does anyone else have a question? No? Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. One more thing, just in response. The question about the best practices are in the report at the front end. So go back to our report and you'll see all that stuff right there.
Thank you.
If I could just add in another way to get information as to what's going on in other states. As legislators, we have access to NCSL, and they do great work in that kind of space.
And that's where the performance note idea came from, was
Yes.
CSO. And we tried to add not just a fiscal note, but a performance note to being able to pass legislation before you did it.
Well, I certainly appreciate that.
So I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead, please.
The question of more JFO help and time, and Vermonters not wanting to give more money to fund that. And then if you put that beside a program that operates for a number of years that isn't effective at all, it's the same issue that we have in health and mental health, prevention versus crisis intervention. Yeah. And we tend not to ever look very seriously at prevention because we have to be doing this at the same time. So even though prevention would save us in the long run. But
that is spot on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Auditor Hoffer. We appreciate your taking time out of your morning to join us.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you.
Yep. Take care.
Thank you.
Care.
Bye.
All right. Believe it or not, we're
Right on time.
right on time. The next item on the agenda is to review Act 146 provisions for this committee. I think it's important too that we remember that we're talking about two reports. There's the outcomes report, which Justin Kenny does as the Chief Performance Officer. And then there's this committee's annual report, which we will look at a little bit later today. And they are they're separate reports. I just wanted to make people aware of that.
And to underscore it, the report to which Auditor Hoffer was just speaking was the state outcomes report.
Correct.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes.
All right. So Amber, if you and Tim want to come up together or independently or however you want to do it, but we want to walk through Act 146. Thank you both for joining us.
Oh, of course. Thank you very much for having us. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen and I'll project the presentation that we had shared, sorry, that's posted on the committee's webpage specific to this topic.
While he's doing that, I'm going to pass out the draft report from this committee, which we will look at
Later.
probably, well, 12:45, looks like. Yes, Jim?
Okay. Good morning again, everybody. To reiterate, my name is Tim Devlin. I'm the newest attorney in the Office of Legislative Counsel. This is my third week, so while I have been trying to bring myself up to speed on these materials, I will have to ask for your patience if I indicate that I may not have to answer to any questions you pose today, but I will certainly be able to provide a follow-up in short order. This morning, I will be providing a brief overviews on the committee's duties and structure under the law, as well as an overview briefly of results-based accountability. First, I'd like to speak about the duties or the charge of the committee. The Government Accountability Committee, or GAC, was established in 2010 by Act 146, which laid out and codified GAC's duties and structure in Title II of the Vermont Statutes annotated Section 920. Importantly, the overarching goal of the committee is to, and I quote, recommend mechanisms for state government to be made forward-thinking, strategic, and responsive to the long-term needs of Vermonters. Specifically, the Act has 9 charges. I'll provide a condensed summary of the statutory requirements. GAC shall review the statutory mandates for duplicate public services, review the legislative process for the creation and elimination of programs, and recommend strategies and tools to prioritize investment in programs. These next charges are particularly relevant to the committee's more recent activities. GAC also shall determine the database program level performance measures that demonstrate program results. GAC shall determine that the database program performance measures that demonstrate the program results have been adopted for the programs in each agency and department. GAC shall determine whether each agency and department is taking actions to achieve the population outcomes, and GAC shall ensure proper reporting. GAC shall also assess the effectiveness of population level indicators in measuring progress in achieving population outcomes. GAC shall approve the addition, amendment, or elimination of indicators, and GAC shall assess whether and how the state should fund nonprofits and to integrate results-based accountability, or RBA, into these. And regarding the structure of the committee, GAC is a joint legislative committee consisting of 8 members who elect 2 co-chairs, 1 from the House and 1 from the Senate. The Chief Performance Officer, CPO, of the agency of administration serves as a non-voting liaison to the community. Importantly, as we see in subsection G at the bottom here, at least annually by January 15th, the committee reports its activities together with any recommendations, if they have any, to the General Assembly. Now, we turn to results-based accountability, or RBA. Simply put, RBA is a method of reporting outcomes using indicators. Title II of the Vermont Statutes annotated, Section 2311, establishes 10 desired population level quantity of life outcomes. An example of one of these outcomes is Vermonters are healthy. The statute also provides a process for this committee to approve indicators, which are data intended to demonstrate that the state's progress in reaching those outcomes is being accomplished. For example, the percentage of adults who smoke cigarettes is one of the indicators demonstrating whether the state is reaching the desired outcomes of Vermonters being healthy. Further, the statutes require the CPO to annually submit the state outcomes report on these outcomes and indicators. In 2020, Act 166 required this committee to focus on approving population level indicators that demonstrate the quality of life of Vermonters who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, that is BIPOC, in relation to the population level quality of life outcomes. The act amended section 2311, the RBA statute for short, to emphasize the importance of considering the experiences of Vermonters who are members of marginalized groups, especially in population level indicators. And this concludes my overview of those topics. I'm happy to take any questions, but again, I may have to respond at a later time. I want to make sure I get the answers right. Cameron, do you have anything to
I do not
speak to that?
I think that was an excellent overview.
Anyone? Yes, Representative Thomas?
I would just like to thank Pledge Council for the presentation, because we cannot ever forget what we are responsible for and not responsible for, as well as for the public record, for there to be recognition of what we are and are not responsible for. So it sets a context for what is going to be discussed further on in this meeting, as well as moving forward.
Anyone?
Thank you.
I don't know whether it's helpful or not that we sort of go back and remember when it was that we got on this committee. I can remember meeting upstairs in, I think it's now the House Natural Resources Committee room, used to be called the Ethan Allen Room. I don't know whether they still call it that or not. So as far as I can recall, I came on the committee probably about 2016 or 17. Senator Snelling was still in charge of the committee, I think, when I first began. And we've had different senators through the period who were there for a biennium and then came off and someone else took their place. I just have sort of hung around since then, and I don't know how many. Well, let's just go around. You were after me or with me, or I can't remember exactly.
No, I have been hanging on way too long. I was part of the committee that was set up to look at how we best could look at the issue, and it was generally around budgeting. So we spent a lot of time, this is before there ever was a gap.
Okay.
We spent a lot of time working with different ways of evaluating and measuring, like the lean method, RBA. We had people from Connecticut come up and talk to us. That's the method that they use. So so yeah, I've been hanging around since Diane Snelling. This was her issue, and then we did set up the Government Accountability Committee and defined the outcomes and made an attempt to define the indicators, which have changed over the time. So yeah, so I've been there too long. I don't remember what did you say, when was it set up?
2010.
2010. And so we probably were working on the issues, and I don't remember, there was some kind of a committee working on those issues for at least a biennium before that. So, yeah.
So Representative Brumsted, how long?
I started in 2017.
Okay.
So, because I was elected in 16, and I was on the Government Operations Committee, and that's part of the rule that a certain number had to be here, and was very interested in the work and went to NCSL conference and participated in government accountability. And that's where I came back with that idea of performance note. The thing that really struck me in your, just a fresh start of looking at what is our real role and what are we supposed to be doing? It is broad, and we don't meet enough for that. So I do feel like it might be time to, and I know this is it probably for all of us, and at least this group during this session, and we need maybe to take a step back and relook at what makes the most sense, because so much in the ability to gather data and to look and measure and look at best perform has really changed in the last 10 years. And right now, I think we have a climate change or a climate council that has a whole data arm. We have the childcare that at Building Bright Futures has a whole data arm. We have Justin with a whole bunch. I'm sure you could name a bunch more.
I will not, but I could.
And I went to one of those meetings and I was overwhelmed by everyone who was collecting data. I went to Maida and said, oh my gosh, how do we bring all this together? And so I really think it's time. And I actually did go and speak a little bit with the speaker about that it's time for us to think about all of this. And so I really appreciate your giving us sort of that fresh look, because it, for me, says in neon, it's time. So thank you.
It's interesting you bring that up. Senator White and I had a discussion on the way up. We carpool from Bethel about where do we go? Is it time to change existing statutes? Is it time to sunset and restart it? And we can certainly discuss all that, but I want to keep going. So Justin, I know obviously you're new to the committee. I was on with your predecessor and
Sue
so,
Zeller,
yeah, Sue.
as you mentioned.
Yeah, so I joined last year, but I've been in and around this work since 2013,
Okay.
having been involved in the initial LEAN initiative at the Department of Environmental Conservation. So it's in my blood.
Representative Fabe.
So I was elected in 2020, and when we were doing our assignments, I'm on government operations, and I was appointed to this committee.
And Representative Dolan.
Similar timeline to Representative Fabe, just the past 2 years. And also, for me, it seems like the past 2 years, we really have been focusing on the outcomes indicators and looking at specifically for the BIPOC lens of it. So again, thank you for the presentation, because I feel like the first objectives that we have of proposed areas for the review of statutory mandates for public services, review the process for the creation and elimination of I was like, oh yeah, that's part of what we do too. And so one of the things that I have kind of just taken, because I agree with data, this is great. And also hearing the auditor's report, we can be looking at it through all different lenses and being like, oh, well, I think it looks great. And somebody else could be looking at it from this perspective and being like, well, that looks horrible to me. It seems like there's a role for kind of getting everybody on the same page, that we are looking at the same thing through the same lens, or at least have a common goal, or that we as legislatures all have buy-in of like, we're working towards this. So I could agree with this piece of like, we need kind of a new reset or something. I don't know if I know for certain what that is, but I think there could be room for that.
And lastly, Representative Maida. I don't know who the House person was when Diane Snelling was, because they must have been co-chairs.
I don't recall. I started on government operations in 2013, but I don't recall who from the committee was.
Okay.
And it might have been Donna Sweeney.
I think you could be right.
Yeah, I think so, because
She was chair.
and she also was involved before GAC was actually instituted.
And I came onto the committee somewhere in the mid 2010s.
Oh,
Not right at the beginning of my time on GovOps, but
okay. So
well before.
you've served on this committee longer than anybody else.
Well, no.
Well, we must have come in the same time.
No. I was here
2010s.
before it was GAC. I've been
Okay.
here since the very beginning.
All right.
Not the initial 2000, not the 2000s.
All right.
Not the first part, but once we get into the teenage years of this century.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think given the auditor's comments, we probably do want to, it's a separate issue from what we want to get done today, but I think it's important that we do take another look at this. And, it almost, I don't know that it needs to be a standing committee. forgive me for being a little pejorative, but in the Senate, we do serve on 2 committees. So it gets a little bit hard for that extra committee to find time just to meet. And this has been an off-session committee for the most part. We only kind of get together a few times during the off-session.
Yeah, since I'm not going to be here anymore.
You can give us your.
I can.
Shoot from the hip.
Yeah.
That's right.
So when I was listening to those and watching and I'm saying, what really is the role of this committee? To review the process for the creation and elimination of programs? I don't think so. I think that's the role of standing committees. I wonder if so Senator Collmore and I also serve on another summer committee, which is called the Sunset Commission, Sunset Advisory Commission. We have been going through every single state board, committee, commission, council, whatever they're called, and recommending that, and there are a series of questions that they have to answer. And one of them is there still a need for this committee? Could the functions of it be better handled elsewhere? I mean, the specific functions. And if that's yes, where could they be handled? So those are some of the questions that we look at with every board and commission in the state. And we were talking about maybe this committee should come before the sunset, should answer those questions and say, is it still a viable committee, or are there other areas where those things could be handled, like all the data, different places, and really, do we review the process for elimination and creation of services? I don't think so. Isn't that a standing committee issue? And now the training that you guys set up for new legislators and stuff has kind of become embedded in the training itself, to think in terms of what are the measurements and how the evaluations, and how do we look at legislation. So maybe, and then look at what of those functions doesn't live someplace else, and does there need to be a different committee formed to look at those maybe 3 or 4 functions as opposed to 9 or 12 or whatever there were? I don't know.
And it could be suggested that since a new biennium is about to be convened, it would not be outside of the realm of the respective government operations committees to take a look at this question, and legislation. A good time for legislation to be crafted is at the beginning of the biennium, so that there's adequate time to deal, especially with something. I think this is a very meaty kind of question to be looking at in terms of what this committee should be moving forward, if anything. It's extremely important, and to involve the 2 key committees of jurisdiction would be pretty important.
And I think a key question to ask is does it make sense to change the legislation to reflect what this committee should be doing, or does it make sense to sunset this committee and create a new one?
Correct.
Because trying to change all the legislation is a little complicated, but anyway, so those are.
Well, and I would say one of the first things that we don't do, that the people that are running those towers of data out there that are in different areas are most concerned about, is that they're collecting. One of the things we do when we pass legislation, if we set up a mechanism to collect data in that area, is that those people become very connected to that, and they don't want anyone else telling them what to do inside of that tower, right? And then you got another tower and another tower, and then you have poor people like Justin who are trying to say, wait a minute, I have an outcomes report to do here, and I could really use some of that data. And that's not happening. And so to me, we need legislators to stay involved in some way that they provide some sort of sorting and assurance that we're looking back and saying, how are we doing on that legislation? Are we taking care of the homeless? Are we? Because what we have heard over and over again, and I've only been on this committee since 2017, is that we can't collect that data. That would cost a lot of money. Or how would we even collect that data? Where would we go? So instead what's happened is our little committees have all said, well, we need to collect that data, so we're putting it in the legislation.
And it happens.
Right. So there has to be some sort of oversight without the emotional connection to it, that they want it to come out a certain way and read a certain way and look a certain way. And I don't know how to do that. I've been talking about this all summer. I talked to Victor about it back in May because I was like, what are we going to do?
The point you're making speaks very much, in my mind at any rate, to the whole concept of it takes a village, not this part of the village and that part of it. And what you described is a different version of siloing that we have been trying to break down within the legislature itself and state government itself, this sort of thing, to whatever degree that's been successful. But that there has to be, I mean, we've seen in terms of the needs of Vermonters, how childcare, housing, economic prosperity, all these things are interrelated. You know, can't hire people at the hospital because there's no place for people, they can't find a place to live that they can afford to pay for. I mean,
or childcare.
It's all interrelated. And it can't be in towers or silos in terms of the data supporting this, that, or the next. Anyway.
Yep, no, as the chair of my other committee, so I'm on GovOps with Senator White, who's the chair of agriculture. Senator Starr often says, well, we don't want to keep plowing the same ground. And it seems as though in some ways we are doing that because we have different groups sort of collecting the same, maybe not the exact same, but very closely related data, unshared apparently with others that are doing pretty much the same thing. And in many ways that adds to the expense of this because we're paying people to sort of run around and do the same thing all the time. And we never seem to ever get to a final, this is what we need to do kind of thing. So.
You know, maybe if one of the things that Doug talked about was more that committees need more resources from JFO. Maybe if committees had more resources from JFO, the committees of jurisdiction would be able to understand the data and the measurements behind the things that they're doing. I don't know if that made any sense, what I just said, but I just was thinking about that, you know, like he said, economic development and commerce don't have any dedicated JFO person. And I don't know that government operations needs one, but health.
Or human services.
Human services, you'd think that they should have somebody, so then you would,
You got to talk with appropriations.
Yeah, exactly.
In both chambers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the committees, the appropriations committees would be seeking to have the recommendation from the committees of jurisdiction in terms of policy. Is this what you really need? And to convince the money committees, the appropriations committees that, yes, this is what we need. And, you know, help us find the money to support it.
But I'm thinking of I'm on judiciary and we do a lot of stuff in there and there's no JFO people that come regularly. I mean, we have attorneys, but And what is done in corrections
Yes.
and judiciary is huge economic impact.
Yeah.
It's,
We don't really see joint fiscal until we ask for a fiscal note. And then all of a sudden, someone from joint fiscal will come over and explain their fiscal note to us, right?
right.
And I'm confused about whether or not it's joint fiscal that we need more support from, or from some kind of data. I don't know what that is, but one thing I think could be helpful, and maybe this is like, I shouldn't even say this out loud, but is to hear from the people who are right now doing the work of collecting data and looking at it, like Building Bright Futures and the Climate Council and Justin. I mean, we've heard from Justin, so we have a good sense of how you go about your work, but that might help us to see what is it that committees don't have the support of right now. Is it a quasi public-private type thing? What is it that would make it work best? I'm not sure it's joint fiscal. Could be an arm of Ledge Council. It could, I feel like we're not in a position right now to recommend what that is.
No, that.
Oh, no, I don't think.
We're not bringing any pardon me for making such a statement. No, we're not in a position, no, we're talking here. We're trying to brainstorm a little bit. It's not our role at this point in time to be.
Senator White.
So one of the things that when we created ADS, Agency of Digital Services, and then when we created the Bureau of Racial Statistics in the criminal justice system, one of the things that I felt very strongly about is that somehow all of the statistics and all the data should live in some arm of ADS, that they wouldn't necessarily interpret it or use it for policy, but that that's where we set up the Committee for Artificial Intelligence is under ADS, collecting that data. I don't know, but it made sense to me, but.
Representative Lefebvre.
Thank you. So being on government operations, I know there's many bills that were brought to us that wanted to just start up more studies. And my frustration came through that. So how can we already be making these laws that we have without this information? So it must be somewhere. And as I said, we're paying people to do the same work over and over. And I do think if someone holds it that doesn't have some of the emotion to it, like having somebody else hold this data that we can still run things through, that might be better. Like, I know that people are pulling in, like I am now teaching, so I use Bright Futures all the time. So I do really ask a lot of questions. But I do feel that there's this hold of the data that we have and getting the data collected, but we want more and more of it. And that's not bad, but we need to have it released so it's not so territorial. But I do think some of the things that were brought up and the wording is something that we should work on if it is ours. And I do think that's one of the areas that is ours of wording, to make sure that what people are interpreting is what they intend, they think they're getting the answer of. But I do wish that Auditor Hoffer had more recommendations for us than what he did, because there was certainly a lot of fault thrown and not much of what was us. It's good to highlight where there's things that could be better, but I think other people should have been at the table to hear that, besides poor Mr. Kenny hearing all of this. Like, I mean, you shouldn't have been the only one here when there were, I think we were finding other people need to be involved in some of this. And I do think if we're looking at ways, my feeling would also be that this would be something to stop and then start with a clear intentions versus try to legislate our way into fitting what we are. That gets messy, and there's no need for more mess.
Are you saying there's mess?
I will say that very clear, there's mess. But I do think that the members that are at this table, I've been very transparent about we need to do something, and if that's what our sole job is in the last 2 years I've been here, that's okay. We will find the right avenue for this to go, but the siloing is very clear, definitely in GovOps, that like we need access, and if it means somebody else houses that data, that has no emotion to it, but they make sure that it's accessible and that it's, again, they're not interpreting it, but they make it look pretty so we can get it. Like, that's also helpful.
Good points.
It's just, yeah, because once you start having other people, once you have to go to the committee or whoever agency has it, they start putting their own flavor into it. That maybe someone that doesn't do anything besides, oh, you want to tap into here? Here you go. I can't tell you anything about it, but I can give it to you. Like, that's helpful.
So at some point, we should figure out whether that's, because the Sunset Advisory Commission is sunsetting at the, and we have 2 meetings left this month and next month, and then that commission is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Now, it doesn't mean it can't reignite, but if we feel strongly enough that we should appear before that committee, I want to make sure that 1 or 2 of you are willing to come before that committee and talk about some of the things that we're talking about. And maybe we shouldn't, maybe we should, I don't know. I'm just saying, we don't have like a lot of time left, because that's a real easy vehicle to jump on right now. But at the end of November, it won't exist anymore. So
The way we've done this with other things where there's for example, it wasn't diversion, it was, I don't remember what it was, something in corrections. And they felt that the way the legislation was written was not good, and that the judiciary committees should relook at the purpose and the legislation and stuff. And so the way we did it so that it didn't get lost in the shuffle was to put it, we create a bill at the end of it, and it says this committee should be repealed, that's the word we use.
Yeah.
Repealed, and we put all the committees in there that should be repealed, or we put in there that this committee or commission is, there's lingering questions about it, and the committees of jurisdiction need to look at. We did that with the State Board of Education. We actually repealed the State Board of Education and said that the committees of jurisdiction needed to look at it, and they did, because otherwise it would have been repealed. And so that just puts it in a bill so that it doesn't just kind of get lost.
Yeah.
And so we could, if we felt that, we could say that this committee needs to have real deep look by the committee, the 2 government operations committees, and not make any recommendations, but just say that so it doesn't get lost. Anyway, that's a way of doing it.
By the way, thanks to Mike's efforts, Mike Ferrant, by the way, because we're on the record. Representative Donna Sweeney was the GAC vice chair, 2009, 2010.
She was adamant, it's pronounced Swaney.
Sweeney,
What did you say?
Sweeney.
Oh,
I'm very sorry, Donna. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
The only thing before we jump to that stage, I think we probably need to talk a little bit to our speaker and our Senate Pro Tem, but that would be hard in the Senate right now. But don't you think it might be shocking for them to just all of a sudden it's gone without their?
well, it isn't gone. It's just telling the committees of jurisdiction that they need to look at the legislation that created it and decide whether it needs to be revamped or sunsetted, deleted, and have a new, it isn't just
Done.
doing it away.
Okay.
Representative Townsend.
Okay, I'm thinking a procedural kind of thing here. This topic wasn't even on our agenda.
Very true.
There's been no public notice that we were going to be talking about such a thing anywhere, any place. I don't know that was in anybody's head walking in here that, yeah, this is what we got to talk about today. God forbid, we should have to have another meeting, but, Brian, I'm sorry.
Just hit her.
You haven't talked me into it yet.
Just, yeah, I'll move back further away. As a thought, some good conversation has really happened around the table here, involving every, well, Justin, you haven't weighed in, but. And from
He's nodded his head.
From the members of the committee, per se. It's time to think. We could scheduling another meeting is sometimes the hardest thing, and getting a quorum. But at the next meeting, and to have it, that could be a major, if not the major topic to actually further discuss if there were people we thought we needed to hear from on that issue, to invite them to come and talk to us from their perspective as to what they would think about this. But to hopefully make a decision at that point in time, as opposed to doing a kind of rabbit out of the hat here. No.
Yes, Senator White?
That could happen. I do think that because the auditor's report was here, a lot of this conversation came in response to the auditor's report. So I think that anybody who had an interest in what the auditor had to say and what our responses might be to that report wouldn't have come to this same conclusion, but would have been interested in what our responses were to his report. But either way, I'm okay with it. So I'm okay with it just happening here. I'm okay with it in another meeting. And it just means that Brian and I get to ride together more often.
Okay.
Well, if it's the only topic, it could well be a Zoom meeting, which would be
That would be easy.
a little easier.
Oh,
Not that I don't want to ride with you again. I'm certainly glad to do that. But if we're only going to talk about one thing, it seems almost superfluous to have you hike up from
yeah.
down south in Brattleboro all the way up. I don't know. Maybe we keep talking.
I just will say that Morgan from Building Bright Futures has already asked me about speaking with the committee about how they do their work, how we do our work, and trying to marry the two. So once she hears about this, I have a feeling she'll say, I'd really like an opportunity before you do that.
Wouldn't she be more likely to talk to the government operations committees about how a new bill or a new committee should be constituted as opposed to us?
I think that she would be open to either, but I do think that there are some of us that might be helping with that. And wouldn't it be nice to have some more to say about what we're going to do with the Sunset Committee? Could there be a couple of sentences to the committee with some thoughts of things they need to look at? I'm just worried that the government operations committees are really busy too. And so I just want to be sure that it's given as much attention as it deserves.
Yes.
My experience when we have sunsetted or when we sunsetted a bill, we did a couple, is it was not taken lightly. And we called in anybody who wanted to come in. It was almost like a public forum of whatever we needed to hear from. And if any of us wanted to be there, that absolutely would happen. Like, it's not taken lightly. It's given its full time to be there. It's not like a quick look at it, goodbye. The only time we did that, we even then had to still have a discussion about it, was one that never even met. Like, it was started 10 years ago and they never met. And we still had people come in from then and explain to us why. Nothing just goes away. And if it's going to be any of those versions, if it was going to be started again in a different way and you're building a committee, then that also would go through another very well thoroughly looked at. Because if it's being brought up that there's something wrong, then the attention goes to it. Granted, the members that did that, most of them are not running again, just to be honest. But I know those of us trying to come back have that same sentiment of it's something that we take serious and that it was a very big deal in government. It wasn't just, it took, honestly, like one committee did not meet at all and we still went through and looked at every bit of it.
That's helpful. Thank
Yes, and people get broken up into different groups as well to look at things if they need more background, and it doesn't take committee time, like you get homework to go with and you have a certain time to come back, and that's what we do. So I truly, I think that if Morgan wanted to come speak, it would be better for her to speak to government operations if that's where this is sent, because then they would be the ones deciding.
I would note we've been joined by Senator Perchlik. Thank you very much for coming today. Representative Townsend.
How about a middle ground between what I suggested and Senator White suggested, taking into consideration Rep. Brumstead's observation regarding the legislative leadership? Given our conversation here, which has been Zoomed, right? It's everything.
It's on YouTube.
Yeah,
It's on
yeah.
YouTube, okay. So it's publicly shared. The transparency is there. We could always determine here that today that we would hope that the Sunset Commission might include in its report a recommendation with regard to this committee being looked at by the respective GovOps committees. And in the meantime, we as co-chairs could give the appropriate heads up to our respective leadership, pro tem, speaker, so that it's not like, what?
Okay.
Andy, you missed this whole conversation, but we're just all going to go home now and forget about it. No, the auditor's report pointed out some things, and then we started talking about how I think Jessica said it was a neon light for her that we needed to do something. And so we're talking about, should this committee be sunsetted, repealed? And looking at the core functions, should a different committee be set up that really focuses on what, that's what we're talking about.
Right. Which I think we included that as a question in our report. Wasn't there something in our report?
Well, that's the sunset. So we're talking about this committee going to the sunset committee and being included in the bill. Yes, the same questions were asked of your efficiency or whoever, right?
No, I'm talking about this committee's report to the legislature included a comment or a question
about the future of it.
It was in last year's report, the recommendation that
that'd be looked at.
that these statutory charges be reviewed.
Yeah.
But people, since it's a report, if you put it in the sunset thing, it's in a bill.
Sure. I understand.
And it's harder to ignore.
Yes, Representative Dolan.
Yeah, I would totally support this. I feel like it is a good middle ground. I feel like the committees of jurisdiction should be reviewing our committee anyway. So we're not putting anything out there that's like, wow, why are we going to have them do that? Like, that would be great. And I think for a new biennium, for folks to have a fresh start looking at what we want to look at for outcomes, and it sounds like a great start to me. So seems like a win-win.
Okay. Does anyone have any objection to going that way?
No. Can I just get another, like a 30,000 foot of what? So you guys are going to go back to the respective leadership?
Yeah, Representative Townsend and I will talk to the pro tem and the speaker to apprise them of what we've talked about today and the likelihood that we will recommend to the Sunset Advisory Commission that the two committees of jurisdiction, GovOps, take a look at this committee, the GAC committee, and make recommendations.
Is there anything that you'd like us to do?
Maybe one or two people, if, I don't know whether we have time to add this. See, Senator White's chair of the other one, so I'm asking her. We already have the agendas in place for the October and November meeting, but we could probably add something if we needed to.
Let's look at the agenda that we have for, because we should do it by the October
Yeah,
meeting, which is, why don't I?
next week,
Posted to the internet. Yes, October 13th.
13th.
The Sunset Advisory Committee.
Yeah.
No,
No, the 12th, sorry, excuse me,
Okay.
the 12th.
because 13th is judicial nominating.
Oh.
Yeah,
The
okay.
October 12th is. the
Okay,
Sunset
October
Advisory
12th.
Commission, and the agenda is posted online.
Okay. Well, why don't you let Senator White and I noodle that at lunch
Okay.
and maybe come up with a plan.
But if there is time in there, it might be nice to have a couple people just come to the.
Yeah, you just.
I feel weird stepping down as a member of the commission to sit in
Yeah,
the chair
me
and
too.
testify.
Yeah.
Not that I'm afraid to speak.
Yeah,
Would you be up for doing that?
absolutely.
Okay. So now, to get us back on track, we're only 16 minutes late.
We have been totally on the track.
Well, we're on track, we just, time-wise. The next item was to review the annual outcomes report with Justin. And if time, talk about some other issues. So Justin, the floor is yours.
Excellent. I have been quiet because I'm on the agenda to speak and I have a lot to say.
Okay.
Good to see you all again. I'm probably a year older, but maybe not a year wiser. We'll see. I do want to maybe spend 5 to 10 minutes just to respond to the auditor's report.
Sure.
Didn't get a chance to do that last year, and then we can dive into this year's report. So a couple things that have come to my mind. There are a number of items within that report that I wasn't surprised by, and I don't think the committee was surprised by. We've been talking about ways to improve the report for years now. You've all been engaged in that work. We know that some of the indicators need some help. We need to disaggregate a number of them. We know that potentially we could reword some of the indicators, as he had mentioned, and I think that is one point that I took away was there's a couple places where it says rate or percent, which leaves it up for interpretation from the data stewards. Do I provide a rate or do I provide a percent? Right. So we could get a lot more clarity in terms of what specifically is required with each individual indicator. I also think in terms of the presentation of data, we know that we need to do some better work on the presentation of the data and that we need to create some consistency in terms of what people are providing. Like everyone should have a story behind the curve and there should be notes on methodology, which actually we've addressed in this year's report. So a number of those items we already knew about, we were working on them. Two things that were surprising to me. One was the report felt very one-sided. It didn't provide much recognition to the work of this committee over the years and how difficult this work is, especially when we're resource constrained. So we're trying to gather data on close to 70 different indicators from federal sources, state sources, local sources, nonprofit partners in some cases. And we're asking a lot from our data stewards to do that. And then if we were to ask additionally to now add benchmark data from other states, New York, New England, maybe we're looking at the entire country, that's a lot of additional work. So just to lay that out there. Also, the Results Washington was mentioned, which I'm really jealous of them. I look at their work a lot. They do really great things. They have an office of 11 people and we have an office of 2. And I was solo for probably an entire year before we just recently brought the second person on. So in terms of resources and scale, it's just a little bit different. They do amazing work. I want to get there, but very hard to produce that level of work with the current resources that we have, right? I also felt like the criteria used, so we mentioned Results Washington and GASB, was not necessarily the right criteria for this report. So that criteria assumes that we are looking at a performance report, which the annual outcomes report, personally, in my opinion, for following results-based accountability, is not a performance report. It's a report on conditions of well-being for Vermonters. It does not speak to what the state has done, what the legislative branch has done, what the executive branch has done, or any of our nonprofit partners to move the needle on any of these things. It's simply reporting the facts. This is the data at this point in time. That's why you see in most of our indicators, and I pulled out a lot this year, there are no things like targets or goals, because the goal is get better. Recidivism rate, would we set a goal for recidivism rate? Would we set a goal for average median income? When we're not talking about a specific program or initiative or a policy, we wouldn't. And so that's why like those elements of the auditor's report, I was like, this doesn't make sense in the context of what this report really is, which is not about the performance of state government. It's about conditions of Vermonters. If we were going to do some of the deep dive work that he was mentioning, that would be a very large report if I was going to do a deep dive on 70 different indicators. We have performance reports around the state, Climate Action Council, right? There's reports on that. There's reports on clean water. The Water Initiative Program does a great report. There's reports across the board that speak to what's actually being done. This is not it. This is intended to be a tool for use by legislative branch, executive branch, whoever, to say, hey, this is data, and we want to move the needle on these. Are we getting there every year? And if not, what are we going to do to attempt to move the needle? So just to hit on a couple of those things. Again, some of the things, not surprising. We know we need to work on that stuff. And the other thing, I was like, that doesn't make sense in the context of what this report actually is.
So
Yes.
can you re-say the first part, like, not, so you just said that this is when he was comparing to what he wanted to see and comparing us to Gatsby and whatever.
Those are traditionally used for performance reports.
Yeah.
Which speak to, there's a goal or a target we're trying to achieve. Are we actually getting there? And what is the work that has been done to do that?
Could you give the actual words that go with GASB? Not everybody might understand what GASB stands for.
Government accountability, I forget what it is. It's, oh my
I
gosh.
can't spit them out myself.
Yeah, I can't.
It has to,
Yeah, it's
the
like,
treasurer uses GASB all the time.
yeah, it's a set of, there's a set of standards there,
Yes.
criteria used to assess this.
Yeah.
And again, they work for performance reports, which might be at a programmatic or a policy level or an initiative level, but not for just a general report on data related to conditions of Vermonters.
And you thought that what you have, like the outcomes report or what he was comparing us to, you considered that to be more of a,
It's just, you could almost think about it as a status report, I
Okay.
guess would be the way to describe it.
That would be data on conditions of Vermonters, right? I was scrambling too with you.
Yes.
Trying to write that down, so I just- I know, it was so perfect the way you
so
said it.
perfect.
Yeah, and I think, part of it is potentially the language in the outcomes bill that speaks to this does make it seem like this is a report on the state's progress. And I think there's an assumption that the state is the executive branch. I don't think that's actually what was intended.
Yes.
Because this report would look like very, very different
Yes.
if I was doing a performance report. It would be probably thousands of pages and I would just be recreating work that other entities have already done. Right?
Right.
So.
Good, such a good clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, so you bet. So anyway, in terms of this year's report, so a couple highlights. So again, a lot of the indicators were impacted by COVID-19. There's still some that haven't been collected by nonprofit partners. We know with some of the census data, the ones that we typically use were not collected in 2020, but they were in 21. So you'll see some gaps in the data. But in general, most of the indicators are they're as up to date as we could possibly get them. One of the big changes that we made in this year's report, which is tag on to what I was just mentioning, is we did ask every data steward to provide a story behind the curve to make it match what AHS was doing. So you will see that in the report. In some cases, it's 1 or 2 sentences. We still have a lot more work to do for those stories behind the curve to actually provide the right sort of analysis and context to the trends, but that was a new thing that I asked for. You'll also see in probably 90 to 95% of the measures that there are notes about the methodology that either speak to the data source or the particular way that the data was analyzed or whether there were assumptions behind it. So I asked folks to provide that as well. In terms of benchmarks, which I mentioned, which is hard to get, I did ask for folks to provide a description of any benchmarks that they would use to compare this data against. Those are not included in the PDF version of the report because they weren't consistently given. But if you look in the online version of the report, which is in the Clear Impact Scorecard, you will see benchmark data for a number of these indicators. For the PDF version of the report, it was really going for a consistent look and feel. One big difference is that I did not just print the report as we typically have from the Clear Impact Online Scorecard, because in the past I felt like visually it didn't look very good. It's basically printing out a web page. I wasn't happy with the result of that. And so I went through a somewhat manual process of grabbing all the visuals from Clear Impact and then putting them into a preset template in Word and adding the story behind the curve, adding notes on methodology where they existed. Also adding the agency that was responsible for reporting that data. And then I also include the direct link to that individual scorecard. So if you're in the PDF report, it's almost like 1 pagers per indicator, or 2 pagers in some cases. And there's a link. If you want to get right to the scorecard, dive in where there's additional data, you can do so. So that's a big change this year. It looks very different. And hopefully it makes the PDF version of the report a little more usable. There's a table of contents. You can drop right into any particular indicator that you're interested in. I'm trying to see if there was anything else. I think those are the major things. I guess I would add, we know that there's some additional work that needs to be done. We've been talking about this in terms of redefining those indicators. That's, I believe, on the agenda for a little bit later today. We're excited to go down that road and take a look at some of that work. The work that was going to happen as part of the Community Profiles project has been delayed. And so the contractor that was selected to do that work, right, hasn't been able to get out. We expect that that would probably happen in the coming spring, but it doesn't give us any data to work with right now. There's also talk about merging that Community Profiles project with the Vermont Department of Health's state health assessment work. So that is also one of the reasons for delay. We talked about all the different data sources and silos, right? We have a big project that's collecting up data about communities. Some of it's in here, some of it's not. But we also have the state health assessment, which is a big data collection effort. Can those two be merged in a way that makes sense so that it's one thing versus multiple?
I don't know if it helps. I love analogies, so I can, in my own mind, figure out what we're talking about. So Representative Lefebvre asked the question about the performance aspect versus just looking at data. So I look at it this way. Tell me, Justin, if I'm way off base here. When you go to get your car inspected or your truck or whatever you have to get inspected, there's a way to measure carbon emissions from your catalytic converter, but there's no corresponding judgment, if you will, about where that is in terms of, is it acceptable or not? All you're doing there is looking at a number from something that's coming off the tailpipe. It's somebody else's job, if you will, to come up with the guidelines that say, this is where it should fall. And if it's above that, it's not a good thing. And therefore you can't get inspected. I mean, I don't know whether that's a legitimate analogy, but that's what I'm taking a look at here in terms of your work versus, you know, we're not looking at performance measures here. We're looking at.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I wasn't crazy.
No, population accountability.
Okay, I don't know if that helps Representative Lefebvre, but that's how I looked at it.
Just the way he first said it out the gate, I think does set in, if I'm going to be going in front of the sunset, like why, the importance of what we're trying to say. The work that we're doing, it is good work and it is a lot of work. You know, some of us having to do more work than others. But it also, I think for me, states that like we are being asked, we're being expected to have results of something that is not in our wheelhouse to do. And this is exactly it. Like we kind of got, not scolded, but that we weren't up to par for something that should not have been coming out of our committee. And this is what we do versus what they expected. And I think that would help me be able to present this in a way to help this committee, help the other committees. So I will go back and rewatch the video and get that direct, perfect quote I need.
And keeping in mind that at that same committee meeting, commission meeting.
Yeah.
These two people.
Yes,
Right.
Yeah.
remember that quote. That's what I'm coming at you with.
Representative Brunson.
So I have a question then, Justin. What do you think about this committee? And I mean, I know that puts you in, but you are doing incredible work and you're working so hard to pull it all together. And I know from being at the Climate Council meeting with you that it has to have a feeling some days where you go home and just say, this is way over my head. So,
Yeah,
putting it all
absolutely.
together. So what's your sense? I'd like to hear.
Yeah.
What's your sense of this conversation?
Yeah, there's a number of things in the charge that we looked at for this committee that I think are that would be too difficult for this committee to do. There's a lot of stuff in there. And if you want to do it right, it's going to take a lot of effort and time. Similar to I have a couple reports. There's one on grants and contracts and performance measures that we report it's actually in this report. I look at that and I'm like, gosh, if I was really to be doing that, to be looking at developing performance measures across all the grants and contracts that we do, that would be probably more than just my current job.
Right. So I think there are a number of areas in the current legislation that makes sense to shed, right, to give to somebody else or determine whether or not it makes sense to do that.
I think the environment is very different now than it was back when GAC was created. And data is a central component of that. I mean, you hear this statistic often that's in the next 5 years, we will develop more data than we have in all of human history. It's data is coming, and it's coming very fast. And so maybe the job is really more about wrangling that data and the different dashboards and data sets and making sure that it's available in some sort of consistent way and people can find it, which I think is important and one of the things that I'm concerned about with all the different dashboards that are available. But also that it's being utilized. So same thing with this report. The report's a tool, and whether people look at it or use it or not, we don't necessarily have control over that. But potentially we could start to influence some more of that. And maybe that's where GAC plays a greater role, is to make sure that some of this data, when we get the indicators, the place that we want, is actually being utilized and being looked at by the legislative committees.
We've been trying to have that happen for many years.
Well, I know, it's very difficult.
Just for the record.
It's very difficult.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's the same thing internally, like we were talking about programs and performance measures. We've been working for a long time to try to make sure that all of our programs have performance measures, and it's difficult. We have over probably 800 different programs, and that's a lot of work to develop quality performance measures for every one of those. Tremendous amount of work. And then you have people leave and they don't understand the methodology, you get some data literacy issues, right? Or they might not really have the data. In a lot of cases, they don't have the how well and is anyone better off data. They have the how much because it's the easiest to get. It's all volume, quantity, outputs, but they don't have the other data.
And then to complicate it, a third of the Senate will turn over this year and nearly probably that in the House.
Oh, easily.
Yeah.
And so you're bringing new people in that have no idea about any of this. And it takes a while for them to get up to speed. So.
Yeah.
One kind of superficial thing, but we spent a whole lot of time talking about this back last year it would have been. I'm turning to our administrative assistant right now here, our committee assistant for the time being. We need to have posted on the Government Accountability Committee webpage the annual outcomes report for 2022. Now that it exists, we spent all that time trying to figure out where this report should appear.
There it is.
I remember.
Here, there, the next place, and we settled on our webpage. And we sent out some word to the committee chairs to let them know that's what we had done. But that's our business. But
The 2021 one is there, but
Yeah.
you want the 2022
the one that's just
report.
out, the one that Justin just put out.
You want that in the same place on that static left-hand margin, so it's
Yeah.
always there, you don't have to search for it?
Yes, that was the point.
Can do. I
Yeah,
can do that right now.
that would be excellent.
See, isn't he something?
And so that the full committee is aware. Remember, we also had questions last time around, last year, this would have been on this topic. How to find the outcomes report on that whole long list of legislative reports. I happened to look, bingo, right at the top, there it is. this report is listed on the Ledge homepage under the legislative reports.
And so that's great. That reminds me, so we may not be doing any trainings because we may be in a whole new process, but are you going to try and help our new legislators and those that have never really paid attention but might be interested this year to how to use the report and what it actually does and what it doesn't do?
Yeah, we should do that again as we did last year. We're also planning, myself and then the Office of Racial Equity, to do an orientation with new folks that are coming in to talk about our offices, which this would be definitely a component of my office.
Oh, good. Oh,
Yep.
good. Thank you.
Senator White.
So I'm just thinking here about the, making sure that committees actually use the information. And first of all, you can't tell a chair what to do at all. I'll just put that out there, right, Maida?
I always took any instruction.
Wait, you were
offered every which way.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. Everybody offers, but so it seems to me that the data, the report and the data is actually collected by the administration. I mean, and presented that way. So when there's a bill or an issue that's come forward to a committee, it seems to me that it's the responsibility of the administration to make sure that that committee has that information, because the advocates on any side of an issue are going to come in with their own interpretation and their own set of data. And so it seems to me that it's the responsibility of because most of the programs or requests for money or come from the administration. So anyway, that's just am I wrong about that?
I think that makes sense.
Because I think you're not going to, a chair of any committee isn't going to go, there's so much information they have to gather anyway that to put that on the.
Yeah, and so.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to add staff in this bill for.
No, I wasn't thinking of him necessarily, but if you have a proposal for something in transportation that's coming from AOT or from VTrans, then it's their responsibility to present the data behind their request. And the same thing if there is something coming to health and welfare or human services, it's their responsibility to present the data behind it to support. That's what I meant, not his office. Justin, I just got you off the hook.
Thank you. Representative Dolan?
Yes, I think on that topic, I agree that programs and departments that are seeking funding and stuff like that definitely should be a role. I also see this outcomes report that we create out of this committee is our way to kind of create some checks and balances, because we have identified the outcomes and indicators that we think show the picture of where we stand. So if a department comes with, or an advocate or somebody comes with certain data, we can compare it to what's there and say, okay, well, how does this add up? We're seeing this perspective of it and that. So I think it's important for us to hold both sides accountable, because I think you're right. Chairs might not have time to do it, to read through and see where it is. But I would not want to just leave it that advocates in departments come to the data, that we should somehow have a way to be like, hey, here's our document that we think is sharing the story. How do you want to build from there? So I don't know where it is, but I do think, like, knowing that the report is out fresh off the press, like, how are we getting it out there so people know whether they have time or not? Like, go and look at it. It's a resource that's available.
Justin?
Yeah, I will add that we have a new tool that we've developed. Well, I guess it's a revamp of a tool that was already in existence, which used to be this equity impact assessment tool. So new policy proposals were supposed to answer a series of questions related to this to know whether that there were adverse impacts that were marginalized communities, BIPOC, et cetera. Right. So this year,
We added a number of additional components to that questionnaire. It's now being called the Policy Impact Assessment Tool. It includes questions about how does this policy proposal link to the statewide strategic plan, the annual outcomes report, which particular indicators are you attempting to move? It asks questions about, equity and distribution geographically, and also specific questions about how much, how well, is anyone better off? Do you have the staff to monitor progress? Do you have people that know how to interpret the data related to this proposal? So we're putting in place mechanisms where we would ask people specifically to explain their theory of change, why they think the proposal is the right proposal and it's going to have an impact, and also pushing data to say, you're going to be putting forward something. We want to know whether it's going to have an impact. How are you going to track that over time? And so if folks are going through that process internally, that should make them more prepared to actually provide some of that information to the committees of jurisdiction.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah.
So before we break for lunch, I see Senator Perchlik has a question.
Okay, and that report, the social equity tool, the other day I tried to find it and I could not.
Okay, I'll check on it.
Find it. It was really, I finally just had to find somebody that internally that had it, but I went to all these different state websites thinking surely they would have it, and they didn't have it. And a lot of references to it, but not actually a place you could download it, so.
I'll check on that.
Okay.
Yeah, we do have a training coming up this Wednesday on that too. Yep.
Okay, so we have one more item before we break for lunch at noon. And I want to give Representative Townsend a chance to sort of review the past work on potential changes that we had talked about. We were expecting again to get some input back and recommendations, and Representative Townsend.
Okay, so this is with regard to Act 166. And I've gone through our history with a fine-tooth comb to help remind us what we've done with regard to the task as assigned in Act 166, which was back in 2020.
Right.
And now. And to have that reviewed not only for our sake here, but also for the public record. Because from some quarters, I will be quite frank, from some quarters, there has been inference, innuendo, whatever you want to call it, suggestion, that as a committee, since that was 2020 and now it's 2022, that perhaps we have been uncaring or undutiful in the task as assigned. And I think it's important to understand what we have been doing in regard to fulfilling or attempting to fulfill the task as assigned in Act 166. So bear with me. Okay, so as a review, Act 166 began in this lady's committee, S-124, began as Act.
Can't remember numbers.
Yeah, well, I looked it up. And that year, the session did not adjourn until the very end of September.
That's right.
Of 2020. That was the first year of the pandemic.
Yep.
Okay, 2020, we did not adjourn. We were on again, off again, on again, off again, a variety of times throughout that calendar year. But we adjourned finally the end of September. And one of the last pieces of business was the Senate bill, which became known as Act 166, when it was signed by the governor October 7th of 2020. And there are two pertinent sections within that bill for this committee as it relates to the outcomes and indicators. Section 17 spoke to the fact that by March 1 of 2021, we were to work to approve population level indicators demonstrating quality of life for Vermonters who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And that those indicators were to be included in the state outcomes report done by the Chief Performance Officer. These would either change or add to those delineated in statute already, in the statute from 2014 regarding population level indicators. In section 18 of Act 166, there was further verbiage regarding tending to the well-being of marginalized populations. Instead of referring to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the terminology marginalized populations was used to further clarify. And at that point in time, lest we forget, we were dealing solely on Zoom from after the shutdown on March 13th, 2020, when we were able to get back in business via Zoom, thanks to our IT people within the legislative branch. We were on Zoom through the end of September 2020. On Zoom, November 5th, okay, it was signed into law October 7th. On November 5th of 2020, via Zoom, this committee met to talk about our annual report for that year and to have our first discussions with regard to the task as assigned in Act 166. We met again December 7th of 2020 via Zoom, further discussing what were we going to do, how would we go about reaching out to the marginalized communities within the state to gather the information appropriate to fulfilling our task, being respectful to all involved. So that was through the end of 2020. From the passage of the bill at the very end of September, signed by the governor early October, and then we had the new biennium in 2021. We had a hearing via Zoom, we were still on Zoom, 2021, January 28th. We held a hearing in the evening, beginning at 6 o'clock, which had been publicly noticed, and the event having been shared, the particulars of the event having been shared through our contacts, for instance, with regard to the Social Equity Caucus, and I believe also through the Office of Racial Equity.
Yep.
We're trying to reach out, spread the word, please participate, kind of thing. That was the evening of January the 28th, 2021. On Saturday.
Do you want to comment on how many people showed up?
There were very few people.
4 people.
Very few. They had good commentary to share.
Yes.
Excellent commentary.
They did.
Very few. And it wasn't for lack of attempting to draw people in. I should share with these folks here in the room today, because not everybody was right there at the time. We did receive criticism for the fact that all the notification and communication regarding the outreach to the community, the larger community of Vermont, that it was only in English and that we should have done it in multiple languages. We did not believe that we had the capacity to do that, but it was a valid point which was made. February 20th of 2021, again via Zoom, this committee held a workshop on a Saturday, 1 to 2:30, on this topic to garner more input. And there were more people participating in that. We actually had breakout workshops kind of thing to gather the input over the Zoom. So that was the Saturday of the 20th. On February the 22nd of 2021, this committee, again via Zoom, went over the recommendations that were brought forward from the workshop, because the workshop had also been focusing on what we got through the evening commentary. And we went over the recommendations on February 22nd, coming out of the workshop, which elaborated far beyond where we had been on the 20th. And we also looked at a bill which Senators White and Collmore had been looking at that would have allowed, if it needed to move forward, changing or adding to the state outcomes.
Right.
Because that piece, outcomes can be changed only by legislative action. The indicators can be changed by this committee.
Yeah.
So we were trying to cover the bases. We're trying to do our task. We were doing our task. At that same meeting, February the 22nd, we received input that our efforts were not broad enough, deep enough, inadequate in the task at hand, and that we were not in a position to legitimately propose changes to the indicators or the outcomes. So that's where we were then, February 22nd, 2021. In August the 2nd, 2021, and this was in person here at the State House. On August 2nd, 2021, we held an orientation in this room or for new members of the committee, remembering this was the first year of the new biennium.
Right.
So we had turnover within the committee and the daily work of the legislature underway. So August 2nd, we oriented the new members. We reviewed the actions we'd taken regarding Act 166 and the concerns which had been raised with regard to our process and input. Starting to discuss, well, what do we do now? August 26th, we met again. At that meeting, we addressed questions that we had received from the public with regard to the Genuine Progress Indicator, the GPI, which had been worked out of UVM. And the question had been, should not the GPI be somehow incorporated in the work of the outcomes and the indicators? We had information at that time that the person at UVM who had been responsible for the GPI project was no longer available due to having passed. And there was a whole question of financial resources also. And UVM had not replaced that individual with another person. We discussed further our Act 166 task. And it was at this point, it was within the context of the CDC Health Equity Grant and the Equity Dashboard. Started discussing, well, perhaps the work should be within that broader context. There already is an established outreach to lots and lots of people across Vermont. On October the 7th of 2021, again, here in the State House, these three meetings, we overviewed the then state outcomes report. We ourselves on the committee went through a mini training on data usage and the dashboard. And we discussed training for legislators, the larger legislative body, for later in the fall, because members of this committee had found it so useful that we should share it with our colleagues. It was then that we had a further update from Drew Resley of AHS and Susanna Davis with regard to from the Office of Racial Equity with regard to the AHS Community Profiles Project and the overall timeline, which was to lead to the proposed indicators outcomes ready for us during the summer of 2022. It was reconfirmed that that was the time frame that was being looked at and that we could expect. That was October 7th, 2021. And we had the considered decision at that point. So we're backing away till we have the results from this project, which was to run through the spring, early summer of involving the AHS and the Office of Racial Equity. So as to have the richness of input for any discussion or action on our part with regard to the indicators. All right, October 7th. All right. So then on November the 1st, this was still in person, of 2021. Lord, it was in that context that at that time we had endless discussions about where to link up the state outcomes report. And Mr. Ferrand has given a note. It's already now, the 2022 version is now on our webpage for this year. We had a report as to where it should and could go, this link, because remember we had thought maybe on committee pages and I can't do that. Update regarding which data can be disaggregated in the state income report by race, ethnicity, gender, and age, because questions have been raised about that.
Do you mean income report or outcomes report?
It was the outcomes.
Yeah.
Did I say income? Sorry.
I just wanted to make sure.
Thank you for that. Anything that comes out of my mouth that's odd, let me know. Some people on this, well, now everybody will know. I'm dealing with still some concussion kind of residue.
She fell on the ice. And
I get my staples out tomorrow afternoon. Thank goodness. Anyway, so we also had at that point in time an update on the possibility of our doing trainings for our colleagues with regard to data usage. And we looked at our draft annual report. December 7th of 2021, we were back on Zoom. And we started at 10 and pushed past noon. It went really, really well. We had a goodly number of legislators, of our colleagues, participating in data usage and RBA training. And it was hosted by, we needed to be very careful about this, it was hosted by the Agency of Administration, AHS, and members of this committee. It would have been inappropriate for a multiplicity of strange rules that we ourselves could not simply be hosting this. And all members of the legislature had been invited to attend. Those who attended gave a lot of really positive feedback. It was great energy, even via Zoom. Great energy was coming back to us. Yes. And the plan had been, okay, then in the new biennium, we'll have another legislative training in person for those for whom that worked better. And I think it was Justin who had worked out that the pavilion would be a spot that we could use.
that's right.
Okay, so then we get to 2022. All the plans are, because Omicron had raised its head. Neither chamber was back in person at the very beginning of the session. The House came back after a few weeks, and the Senate was not back until after the town meeting day break. So much for, we had thought we'd do the in-person training during the first week of that session.
That's right.
No. And then coming back after town meeting day, it wasn't until after town meeting day break that we had the full General Assembly in person. And both Pro Tem and the Speaker had thought, yes, we'll do the training once everybody's back in the building. But in that time frame, those who are sitting in this room totally understand. You're in the second half of the session. Bills are being pushed like mad. There is no capacity for people to be attending something else. So it was not scheduled quite intentionally. It was just impossible. It was unrealistic. So here we are later in 2022 now. And remember that we had been waiting since the fall of 2021 for this summer of 2022, because we had been told there would be all this data ready to hand to us for consideration in looking at the indicators, this from that community outreach. Okay, on May 10th, it went out under my email, but inquired May 10th well, yes, on May 10th, we received an email, in answer to an email which I had sent, that the data would be ready late July, early August. Okay, everything's on track. You know, that was the understanding as of May 10, 2022. And August 13th, we sent an email inquiring, having waited till after the primary election. Let's, got to get some things out of the way. But quickly after the primary election, we inquired if everything was ready. Was it time to send out a doodle poll to schedule GAC to receive the information from the community outreach? On August 22nd, we had a response to the August 13th inquiry. August 22nd was when we learned that the outreach had not yet begun, and that it was going to be done through the AHS community profiles along with the state health assessment. And I did send the body of that email response to all members of the committee so that everyone could see what was up. It was recommended in that email that we go through the public hearing process again. And we sent an inquiry asking, are you recommending, this was Drew who had made the recommendation, sent an email asking for clarification if the recommendation meant that we should go through the public hearing process again ourselves, separate and apart from all of the information that was scheduled whenever it happened to come back to us from the community outreach. And we just never received an answer to that question. So that was the end of August of this year. October 3rd of this year, here we are. Okay. And if you've had a chance, which I'm sure you all have, to review our draft report for this year, there is reference made at the end of this draft, which reflects the thinking of at least your two co-chairs here, that we wait until the data is received from the community outreach before we start doing anything with regard to the indicator discussion, as opposed to on our own at this time, off session, in an election season, no less, trying to deal with more public outreach and that whole scene, which doesn't happen easily. Or just wait and try to have the wheel created once and have it be the rich source of data, dare I use the word data, information that we had originally been expecting to receive months ago now. So that's where we are. And I defy anyone to suggest that we have been sitting on our hands.
Thank you, Mayor. That was well done.
Would you, is there a way that you can scan that or have somebody scan it and send it to us? Because I have to say that I've gotten some comments that I liked your comment at the beginning that we've maybe not been very caring or paying attention or to those charges that were given to us. And I would like to have a copy of the timeline because.
Sure. I can take a picture with my phone and send it out, or you want.
Or you give it to.
So we could do that.
You can scan it, right?
Why don't we do that? We'll leave it in Mr. Farren's hands. Oops.
His capable hand.
Representative Lefebvre.
Thank you very much, Representative Townsend, for that. May I inquire, is it someone amongst our body that is accusing us of that? Is it the administration? Is it other commissions? Is it outside groups? Is there someone that we can address or invite in for them to ask us that in person? Because I think that's, to me, it's very offensive to say that we haven't been caring, because I think we all, especially coming in as a freshman, took very much appreciation to the charge that we were given, took responsibility of it. And that's what we talked about for meeting after meeting to make sure that we could. And I would clearly remember how long it took us to decide, where can people get this? Where can people get our information? Where can we put things? And making sure that the charge that we were given to address the marginalized populations, and we took that wholeheartedly. So if other members of I have not been told that we were not doing that. So I feel bad that other members of a committee that I'm a part of are being questioned like that. So if there's something that we can do, regardless of what season or what time or what day or even what time of day it is, like it's not something we take lightly. So I apologize that you guys have gotten those. And if there's someone that we can reach out to have them come to speak to us instead of just sending messages, I think it would have been helpful for them to be here today to hear all that we have done.
Well, one source, not limited to 166 by any stretch of the imagination, just the overall vision of what our committee is all about. I personally found embedded in the auditor's report, which was through which some highlights were raised in today's initial presentation. That our committee is not as on top of things. And when we have met and when we haven't met. There was reference in there even as to the last, quote unquote, at that period of time, the last time we had met as a committee. And when I read that, went a little, because it's like, all they have to do is look. And we have met how many times since, and it made it look as if we simply, I don't know what we've been doing.
Well, thank you very much. And I wish they would have stayed around to hear that.
Representative Dolan.
Thank you for giving that overview, because as you're reading, I was like, oh yes, I remember all of that work. And I remember seeing the auditor's report in January and thinking, I don't know how some of those things add up. I will say that there is part of me that has a bit of concern of us taking so much time to maybe defend our action versus kind of saying, how do we want to hear this voice? Like I would be the same way, like let's have folks come, because I think it's important if folks are saying, you know what, maybe you didn't meet the mark on Act 160. Let's hear that and let's talk about it. How would have some other folks done differently? Or how can we say, like the cards just weren't, we didn't have the best hand and this is what we dealt with and these are our recommendations going forward. I think for us to also just state how important we understand Act 166 was and why we wanted to see it forward. So I guess I'm kind of in the middle of like, yes, it's important we acknowledge we did do good work. And is there room for us to say, you know, if we were dealt a better hand, how could we have done it differently?
Absolutely.
And how can we bring those voices to the table? Because I would like to open it up and say, are there folks that have specifics? You know what, like you should take public hearing. I guess I hear it as wanting to get from more variety of voices. The profiles piece does make sense to me, but maybe it is Susanna Davis's office letting us know, well, what is the impact of hearing it from the profiles or doing public hearings? You know, if she has a recommendation, that would weigh heavy on me putting it in the report. So I feel like I would want to focus more on going forward versus recommitting to what we've done in the past. Because folks can say one thing, but we know what we've done in this room, so.
Yes, Senator White.
So there are also members of the General Assembly who, and I think it is primarily around the idea of hearing from marginalized communities that we haven't done that we didn't do that. And it was we were very deliberative in making the decision that wasn't out. We were not going to do that. That was the community, what was it called? Community outreach, community assessment. process that was going to do that. And I think that there are members of the General Assembly who feel that we should have done it before the community assessment was even considered. That was an opinion that we should be having all these public hearings. And it, as Maida said, having public hearings is really time consuming. And our committee did 8 of them around the state one summer. We heard from about 500 people. And it took a ton of planning, and it was a lot of work for the committee. So this committee decided that we weren't going to do that. And I think that's my where I was upset about it, was because it was all around the making sure that the indicators and outcomes reflected the marginalized communities. And we were criticized because we didn't do that. We didn't have the public hearings. That's my, and it came from the General Assembly. I don't think it came from the administration. I think it was in the auditor's report somehow sprinkled in there. I didn't take as much offense to that as I did to our own colleagues.
Representative Brumsted, and then we got a break for lunch.
Okay.
I would just add into the summary of all the things we did, that October, November, December of 20, right? I think it would have been 20. We put a small group together, and remember Representative Kornheiser was on this committee, and I joined her and Drew. And the 3 of us went off and had 3 meetings in Drew's office about how to reach out to the social equity committee. And we reached out to Coach, I think Representative Christie. Yes. We reached out to him and talked about it. He actually, at that time had some personal issues going on as well, and it was difficult. But we wanted to reach as many, we were really thinking about public hearings at that point with the marginalized communities. But then when we did our first one, where we had really tried, we tried by going through those folks. We had done emails, Facebook. I mean, there was a lot we tried to do, not to mention invitations. We even looked into helping pay for the lost time for people to come. And then we ended up with 4 people. And so we did take a step back in a deliberative way as a committee. We said, maybe we just aren't the right people to pull these folks together, but yet we care so much that we've got to find another way. And we did. We went and we worked with Drew and thought about, well, how could we do this? And Representative Kornheiser at that point was not on the committee because that was more in January. And she was on the Social Equity Council and promised that she would work with them to pull this together. And we got the approval. She went there and spoke to the caucus, the Social Equity Caucus, and got their approval to move forward. So there were a lot of meetings that happened that weren't even in this room, but were directly related to our sending out that work. And so I agree. I've heard from all. I felt the same way as Maida on the auditor's report from the very beginning, and that's partially why I got somewhat exercised this morning. But also, I felt somewhat pushed off when we only ended up with 4 people, and we worked really hard. Yeah. And I went to that meeting and I felt like people accused us of doing all these things wrong when we had no way to know. We did our best. We worked hard. And so anyhow, there was good reason for us to move off of doing the public hearings. And I hope that the people out there watch today and hear that. So thank you for that long list. And
Yeah.
That was well done.
That was good. Thank you.
It's all, by the way, documented online.
Right.
Because
But you
I
putting
went
it
through,
together was,
double checked that I,
That's what I was gonna say, despite capable hands and the documentation here, which is really good, this information is available. As you were going, I was watching the GAC website and everything you said is documented right there. In multiple languages.
oh, on the site, on the lead site.
Our legislative
Yes.
website can translate through Google, so it's not perfect, but through Google into
Haven't you seen? it?
hundreds of different languages if you know how to do that. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, noon. Justin's hungry.
Let's take a break.
So, can we still, do you want to do 45-minute lunch and be back at 1? We're going to just look over the draft report and approve it or not and adjourn.
Fine with me.
Or even a half hour is fine with me.
Okay, then let's.
But I don't know about everyone else.
Yeah. Do
Yeah.
45 minutes.
Okay, so 12:45, we'll be back.
Otherwise, it's hard to eat and see a man about a horse.
Okay.
45 minutes would be one.
1 o'clock.
Yeah,
Do you want 1 or 12:45?
1. I
Okay,
said,
45 minutes.
oh, I said 45 minutes. That's
Right.
what I meant. Because
Okay.
it's hard to eat and see a man about a horse in half an hour.
Just there's that man. Okay,